Hi, everyone. Well, does anyone listening have the perfect marriage or relationship that never needs fine tuning? That's kind of a joke. So I've been married for 25 years and, marriage is work. And let's be honest, doesn't everything in life that's good take effort? My guests today are authors and relationship coaches. They help couples learn communication skills to better understand each other and to resolve disagreements faster. I think you're really going to enjoy their advice, their stories, their approach to happy relationships. There's always something to learn. Here's my interview with Jocelyn and Aaron Freeman. Jocelyn and Aaron, thank you for joining me today. We're talking all things relationships today. And I appreciate you guys coming on. The idea of healthy arguing is important to understand. I've been married 25 years. Arguments are normal part of a marriage, but doing so in a healthy way is what I want to get to today. So thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having us. Yeah. We're excited.
All right. So how can arguing, let's just start with the hard question. How can arguing actually be good for a relationship?
Well, before answering exactly why it can be good, I want to answer why not arguing is not good. And what we find, this is one of our key quotes from our book and something that we will champion for the rest of our lives, is that avoiding conflict in the short term builds resentment in the long term. And a lot of times couples think that, conflict equals divorce, or it means that our relationship is degrading and going the wrong direction. What we find in our work with couples is that the majority of couples who are headed in the direction of disconnection, potentially leaning towards separation, is that they've actually been avoiding conflict for too long, meaning they've been avoiding hard conversations. They've been suppressing needs, wants, desires in the relationship because they're afraid of their partner's reaction or because of how they have fought in the past. And so we want to say that resentment is harder to repair from than when you learn healthy conflict skills. And so do you want to touch on why it could then be a positive?
Let me give two analogies. I really love analogies. First of all, imagine you listening that there's a period in your life where you don't feel as physically fit. So in those moments, you have this experience of maybe low self-confidence, or you don't feel good about yourself, right? So you label that as a negative experience. However, if you accept and own that feeling, what does that drive you to? Well, I'm going to start taking the actions around my nutrition or going to the gym or getting fit. So it drove you to a higher level of physicality. Now, imagine way back when people used to drive like horse and buggies, right? There was a time period where they thought to themselves, this doesn't work at all. It takes us way too long. And it was from that somebody named Henry Ford came up with driving an automobile, right? Or, take that further. So essentially, all conflict is the material in which creativity and innovation happens. So if you had no conflict, we wouldn't be flying in planes. Right. We wouldn't be sending rockets to Mars. We wouldn't have any of the technology we have today, but we don't see it that way in relationships, right? If you could actually own that, we see this differently, our finances or having a kids or where to live, that is the base material that is meant for you to look together as a team on, that's going to move you more towards being connected, being on the same page, moving towards your purpose together. It's just that we don't see it that way. So we allow it to put us against each other rather than linking arms, getting on the same team and saying, how is this meant for creativity, connection, and innovation in our own lives and relationship?
It's such an important concept because it is, of course, it's easier in the short term to suppress conflict. Of course it is. It's like, I don't have time for this. I don't have the energy to fight. I don't have, I got 3 kids and we got dogs and I don't have time to argue. So I'm just going to pretend like I don't care. That's not healthy. But I want to talk to you about like actually having these differences and knowing them either before you're married or when you're married. Healthy relationships can happen with these major differences, right?
Oh, yes.
I mean, you can have different political views, you can have different, all kinds of things and still have a healthy relationship, right?
Oh, absolutely. What we say is that communication is not about always agreeing. It is about understanding each other. And communication and conflict are like our 2 biggest topics. And people resist being disagreed with. And when their partner disagrees them, they focus on, no, I'm going to fight till you see it my way.
Right. Yeah.
But
why do we do that? Why do we do that?
Well, that's just part of being human. We all have this thing called the ego mind, and the ego mind likes to be right. And it likes to prove itself to be true. And so the ego shows up in relationships, and that's part of what we need to have mastery over. And one thing I really had to work, I mean, we're still constantly working on setting aside that desire to be right and instead focusing on how can we just understand each other. And when you actually just focus on understanding each other and you go deep enough, you don't stop the conversation before it gets juicy enough, you can actually create even better ideas from that, from staying in the conversation and not just avoiding it because you don't agree.
I am so guilty of, like, if my husband doesn't agree with the way I've decorated, I will fight to the end to make sure he knows that the blue was the best color. Like, it really, and we're all, I mean, that's a silly analogy, but it's true. Like, we want people to agree with us by human nature.
You know, there's a certain aspect in relationships though, where we feel as if we're being controlled or somewhat dominated or told what to do or dictated to, right? So in all of these cases, it's, well, I'm not going to just have you tell me where I can spend money or how to discipline the kids. So we make these stances in our relationship as to not feel controlled. Now, the interesting thing about that is that might happen in some other area like finances. And maybe you haven't been speaking up, but you feel that your partner often decides how you spend the money. So here you are inside, you know, we have this subconscious mind, we have these emotions. And then so you're like, okay, I'm going to let that go. And then it comes to your decorations and the blinds that you picked out, and your partner says something about it because you hadn't been feeling a sense of control, a sense of power in the area of finances. What are you going to do about the blinds?
Fight for
This is where I draw the line. And you're not really consciously thinking that, but you do have those emotions and your subconscious think, I'm not feeling a sense of decisiveness and control in a relationship. I'm going to make my stance right here and now. And it could literally be about anything. And then that just moves it towards a bigger conflict. Then you bring up things from the past. Then you talk about finances. You're like, how are we talking about finances when we're talking about the blinds?
Right. We call that thrown in the kitchen sink.
Exactly.
You know? Like it becomes a much bigger deal. So, okay. So let's get to solutions. Let's talk about understanding and fighting smart and ways of communicating so that we don't get to the kitchen sink where everything gets thrown in.
Yes. Well, I mean, there's a lot we could start in our book. We do before conflict, during conflict, and after conflict. And it's helpful if couples start to even break it down that way, right? So what can we do before conflict even happens to prevent it? And we have a whole conversation around identifying emotional triggers. It's really important that people have self-awareness about what triggers them in a relationship. And if you think about it, and this was something that took me years, I kind of learned this right before getting in a relationship with Aaron.
Good thing.
Was that the things that kept repeating in relationships were signals for me to heal and repair something from my past. And I kept blaming my partner. No. I'm only having this reaction because you are doing this. But then I looked back and I'm like, isn't it interesting that this keeps happening in my different relationships? So I started to think maybe there's something for me to look at. So emotional triggers, right? That feeling when your partner pokes a sensitive spot.
Give me an example of people you've worked with, or you don't have to give personal, but what's an example of that?
Oh gosh. I mean, there's so many different ones. Like an obvious one for people can be if they see their partner looking at their phone and there's a female on the phone, or another, the opposite sex, or they're looking, right? So people can have emotional triggers because maybe they were cheated on in the past, but there can also be triggers if certain things are said that make them feel like their partner is saying they're not doing good enough. So it could be certain phrases and words that it's like, I can never do it right for you. I can't ever do enough, right? It's triggering a sensitive spot. Something else is going on. And so, I mean, we could talk about this for an hour alone, but it's important for couples to realize you can prevent disagreements by identifying what your triggers are. Is there anything you want to add?
And a deeper part of that is we really want to look at places where we can take our own responsibility. And this is huge for repairing conflict, for not only shortening the argument hangover, but actually getting past it, is that you come to your partner and rather than say, you know what, we can be past this right now. All you have to do is admit where you were wrong and we can move past this. I mean, how many times do we say that? But if I come to Jocelyn and say, hey, you know what, that conflict we had, where I see I can take responsibility is, I know that's an emotional trigger for me. So I take responsibility that I'm working on that trigger. I am sorry for my response. Then that invites Jocelyn into reconnecting with me, which is actually a part of the 5 steps we have to repairing conflict. But if we take more responsibility for our actions and our words, our energy, our attitude, and bring that to the table, it really leverages the principle of reciprocity. Because what's Jocelyn going to say? Oh, thank you so much. You know what? Where I see I could take responsibility is, but one of us has to lead. One of us has to be willing to take responsibility first. And you're in a relationship with someone that you love. They're often going to share where they're taking responsibility, which is kind of what the other partner is looking for. So be the one to go first.
Okay. So in the heat of an argument, how do you apply all of this?
Gosh.
You know, you're in the middle of it. Like you're having like a real dispute. The emotions are still high.
Yeah. Well, first, people need to be aware that things are getting heated and how they're acting and what they're saying is not constructive. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. It actually isn't until after the fact that they're like, wow, I said things that were out of line. I couldn't have, or I could have said that a different way. So what couples need to work on first is becoming better at being aware in the moment. You have to be an observer of yourself, because to get a little scientific on you, we also love like science. There's something called an amygdala hijack. And when you're triggered, when emotion is getting escalated, anger, frustration, sadness, there's actually part of our brain that takes over our logical thinking. It's no longer that you're responding to actually what's being said. You're responding to the emotion that's coming up for you and all the past events that it's reminding you of. So people need to be more present in the moment, realize, oh, I am no longer being constructive here right now. It's probably helpful if we take what we call a timeout, which is different than walking out. So another key tool for people during the heat of the moment is, it's not helpful if you actually just walk out of the room because you're like, you know what? This isn't helpful anymore. Forget it. Let me just leave. We'll come back to this later. That can leave your partner feeling abandoned. It feels like it breaks the emotional safety of the space.
Yeah.
And so what we say is, instead of walking out, declare a timeout, which would sound something like this. Hey, I realize I'm no longer being constructive here. I don't want us to do any more damage. I think it'd be helpful if we took a 15-minute timeout and then let's come back together. So I'm saying how long approximately I'd like the timeout to be. It could be an hour. You know, we don't recommend it being like, I'll talk to you in 3 days, right? Something shorter. And you're saying, we will come back to this, because one of the biggest frustrations people feel is that you never come back to the conversation. So it's like this conflict came up, we didn't come back to it, and then it popped up a week later. So by saying we will come back to this, you're going to come back and get that conversation complete.
Well, and linking the 2 principles together, what someone might do is say to their partner, you're crossing a boundary. I'm shutting this down now because of the actions and the words that are coming out of your mouth. But if you link the principle of emotional triggers together, I could say, hey, I'm feeling triggered. I'm requesting a timeout. All of a sudden, that puts it over here on me, where my partner is going to realize, oh, you know, I'm going to accept this request for a timeout because it's serving them. And in those emotional spaces, right, that's just much better than saying, oh, don't accept what you're saying to me. Shut it down. We're not talking. If you say, hey, you know, I'm getting triggered by something, that allows you to really still empathize and support your partner through the request they're making.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think that couples can do this on their own? Do you think that having someone who steps in and sees things from that higher perspective? Obviously, therapy, couples therapy, marriage counseling can be helpful, but how much do you think people really can effectively do on their own?
I think it's a balance of both. I mean, we're the hugest advocates of what is couples coaching. So couples counseling and couples coaching are different modalities. Both are great. We think there are some incredible counselors out there, but coaching, which is what we do, and we actually do it together with the couple, is about, hey, let's identify the root cause of what's going on. And here's the key thing, the missing skill. And coaching is very focused on skills. And so what a lot of couples are missing is, number one, what's the root cause of this really? And when you're in it, it's hard to see it. But also, what skill are we missing here? And our whole motto is that behind any relationship challenge is a missing relationship skill that can be learned. And so what we do is we work with couples, and then we have accountability, and we have a system for them practicing the skills repeatedly to then, when they're complete with our coaching journey, they know, oh, this happened again. We just didn't use this skill. We need to bring this skill back in. And so basically, we're the biggest, we've had coaches ourselves. We highly recommend having coaching to then have you practice on your own after the fact.
I love that. So what are some of the top missing skills that you find couples having?
I think at the very top of the list, if not number one, it's definitely up there, is just setting agreements. And it's actually having very specific, clear agreements, not your own expectations or assumptions about how your partner is going to act or should speak to you. So let's link all these together, right? So you're now noticing where you have something that's triggering you. And when you get triggered, you make the statement, I am triggered. And then you ask for a timeout. Now what you do is go back and say, hey, clearly there are some things that keep coming up for us. I know these are triggers for myself. So I'm not saying this is you, but when you happen to swear, or when you just turn your back and walk out of the room, or when you mention that I'm acting like my mom or my dad, that just triggers me. So I'd like to make an agreement here that we both are going to agree to, that, in times of conflict, we neither of us swear. We don't relate to each other like our parents, and we don't just leave the room. And getting that clear, when you do it, it's not that you're trying to force a boundary now on your partner. You've already collaboratively agreed to this. So I can now say, hey, we have an agreement around not swearing. Jocelyn's going to say, oh yeah, you're right. Not, hey, don't control how I talk to you. So having agreements for times of conflict, but just agreements in general, I think couples have too vague of concepts. What that means to one person is totally different to another person, or you make an assumption about this is how you should be acting as a partner. We just need to communicate more and express ourselves more for what we do expect, and then make agreements around these things.
One more thing I'll add too, because if I could give you a list, it'd probably be 10 plus skills that couples are missing. That's a huge one. One more I'll add is, we all hear the phrase, communication is the key to a relationship. And couples are like, we got that. That's not helpful to hear anymore, right? And so what does it actually look like to communicate effectively? And we, after working with thousands of couples, have identified that there are actually 4 communication personality types. So obviously in this conversation, we don't have time to go into all of them, because we could talk about just that alone for 45 minutes. But it's helpful and critical that both your own communication personality type and your partner's, because communication is not one size fits all. So a lot of people are approaching their partner in a way that works for them, but not for the partner. And so communication personality types is a critical skill. And then, of course, the reason we titled our book, The Argument Hangover, is having skills to repair from conflict. Because we actually find that it's that repair stage that is even more important than the before conflict stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can avoid all day long, but then if you really can repair and appreciate each other's communication styles and differences, you're going to grow, and your relationship's going to be more meaningful. Let me ask you another question. We often hear advice. I love asking advice from older couples or couples who've been married a long time. And they say things like, always giving credit to the other person, or never going to bed angry. Like, do you believe in some of those? Do you think, never go to bed angry?
Yeah, it's interesting because we have an opinion on that. And I was listening to an Esther Perel interview today, right? She's one of the leading psychotherapists in different elements of relationships. And she was like, that's some of the worst advice out there, right? Like, she's world-renowned, a relationship expert. And I would agree. I think that sometimes, well, number one, I'd say two things. Nighttime is not the time to bring up important topics. And sometimes why people are like either staying up at night arguing, or they're saying, we just need to go to bed, but you're not supposed to do it angry, is because they're bringing up topics right before bedtime, because you put the kids to sleep, you just got done with work. So number one, that's not the right time for those conversations. Second,
well, also because you're pretty drained, right?
Yeah.
You might have, if you're managing kids and all the activities, you probably have low energy already. So one of the triggers of these conflicts is probably just that you're super tired.
Exactly.
So it wasn't even the subject. It was that this was just not a good time.
And so I would agree with Esther in that if you happen to have an important conversation at night and it's no longer constructive, it's again a time for a timeout. And if it just happens to be late at night, that timeout is sleeping. And so, of course, regardless of the time of day, if it's no longer constructive, it's time for a timeout.
This is such an interesting one too, because I think what had happened before is saying, if you go to bed angry, then that's supposed to settle it, right? Like, you're not going to come back to it. But if we did have something with all the things we just said, we just happen to have a conflict and it's not resolved, with communication and having the resolution skills, we can say, hey, I know this isn't complete, but how about we complete this
in the morning
at 9 a.m. tomorrow, right? And when people say don't go to bed angry, it's because they're not coming back to it ever again. Let's forget it. Let's go to sleep. And then it comes up later. But if you have the communication skills to set the time to complete that conversation later, it doesn't matter. I think sleep is super important for all of our health and well-being. So let's get some good sleep and then let's complete this tomorrow. The nighttime doesn't really have anything to do with it. It's that people aren't coming back and actually resolving these conflicts.
Yeah, it's hard to resolve and really get to the core of triggers or whatever it is when you're exhausted and tired. So it doesn't have to be, I don't love you. It's, I love you enough to come back when we're both fresh and really talk about this.
100%.
Boy, such great advice and tips. And I really appreciate your expertise. I want to ask you guys a couple of questions because I like to learn from successful people and I appreciate what you do. So my first question, and you guys decide who takes this, is as a couple and as coaches and as marriage specialists, what's your favorite tool for productivity? It doesn't have to be technology. It can just be a routine or anything.
I'm going to answer it slightly different because people think of productivity as in like, and I love my checklist. Believe me, I'm like a notebook queen. Also, having a clear vision helps productivity. And a lot of people are spreading themselves thin and doing things that don't really matter and feeling overwhelmed with how to prioritize because they're not clear on their vision. So I would just suggest that people spend some time going, what is my vision and what doesn't align with my vision that I can eliminate or I can delegate or I can promise at a later time. Being able to manage your time is to also know what aligns with what I'm focusing on now and what doesn't. And we are super clear on what our no's are and what our yeses are aligned with our vision.
And I love that vision as a couple too, that it can be, have an individual and what's your vision.
We actually have a system for that. That's one of our core, we take couples through a process for the vision.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay. And then my next question, and you can answer this as an individual or as a couple as well, is what's your purpose? When did you realize this was your purpose?
Oh, well, first I heard you say, what is your purpose? And our purpose actually is defined by our vision statement, which essentially is to empower millions of couples with the communication skills to be connected in any season of life. So that's really our purpose and the purpose of our relationship and while we are together. And by looking at that, we see challenges totally different. Challenges happen to us because that's meant to further our purpose in that. Now, we really came to that conclusion or got that clarity in 2016 when we published our first book. And we realized impacting relationships was super fulfilling and something that we were starting to be really good at and wanted to help other couples do well. Then the thing I want to say about purpose is it's always then evolving. It's not that you know your one purpose, because what I talked about in the very beginning, new things are going to arise as you go about your life, new challenges. These things are what show you places to become more resourceful, creative, more connected, innovate more. So though I don't think our base purpose in that is going to change much, that purpose is something that you don't ever really reach, right? Because then you kind of maybe achieve something, but evolved a little bit past that. I think you always want to set this purpose as something that's almost just out of reach, and that always is going to be moving you forward.
And allowing that to evolve. It's important to continue to reevaluate all of those things. Well, thank you so much. Where can people find you or get coaching or get your books and follow you?
Yeah, so I'll reference a couple things. One, we're super social on Instagram. So if you went to Meet the Freemans, we respond to messages. You know, people really love our content, and we're always keeping people up to date with things that we have, like web classes and workshops. So Instagram's a great way to like stay up to date. And then also our book, we've referenced the Argument Hangover. We actually, when we're on podcasts, we give away $200 of extra bonuses. So there's a communication and conflict course and workbook, among other things. And so if you actually go to theargumenthangover.com, you can see all the retailers listed, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, all those. And then you can actually see where to claim those $200 worth of bonuses. So Meet the Freemans on Instagram and theargumenthangover.com.
Great. Well, thank you for your passion in what you do and helping people. It really makes a difference. And it's great to talk to you today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.